The photograph was taken on an afternoon thick with the smell of soot and chalk. Inside Alderwick Primary, the children sat stiffly at their desks as the photographer, Edwin Larch, adjusted the brass lens of his camera. The room was small, barely large enough for 20 pupils, and the air shimmered faintly from the warmth of the coal stove in the corner. A single window let in a column of pale light that fell across the rows of faces, some anxious, some curious, others merely tired from lessons and the endless rumble of the mine beyond the fields. "Keep still now," Larch muttered, his voice measured, polite but firm. He was a man of precision, and his hands, though rough from chemical work, moved with practiced care. He glanced toward the headmaster, Mr. Thomas Quill, who stood near the chalkboard, smoothing his beard as he counted quietly under his breath. 19, yes, Quill murmured. All present except Hartley, God rest him. Larch adjusted his focus again. The faint smell of ether and varnish drifted from his equipment case. He waited for the long exposure to begin, but something tugged at his attention, the faint scrape of wood behind him. When he turned, he noticed the extra desk in the far corner. It was slightly apart from the rest, the kind once reserved for newcomers or latecomers. "Did you wish it moved?" Larch asked, squinting through the dim light. Quill shook his head, dismissive. "Leave it. The carpenter brought it last week and hasn't fetched it back. Makes no difference." Still, the photographer hesitated. The desk's surface was oddly polished, as if recently wiped clean. A faint impression, perhaps a smudge, perhaps a handprint, seemed to glisten there under the afternoon glare. He rubbed at his eyes, assuming the effect was from the fumes of the collodion. "Strange," he murmured, but Quill did not hear him. He bent to light his magnesium flare, the hiss echoing through the silent room. The children flinched as the white smoke curled upward. Larch took a steady breath and uncovered the lens. Seconds stretched into eternity. Every cough, every blink, every shallow breath seemed to weigh upon the air. And yet, in that span of motionless stillness, something else shifted, so faintly that only Larch noticed. The air around the last row trembled, as though disturbed by someone brushing past. When the exposure ended, he felt a pulse of cold against the back of his neck. He turned sharply, but there was only the empty desk. Its grain gleamed faintly, catching the light in a way that no other wood did. "Are you unwell, Mr. Larch?" Quill asked, his tone more formal than concerned. Larch forced a thin smile. "Just the fumes, sir." Nothing more, but his voice wavered slightly. He packed his camera quickly, wrapping the fragile plate with trembling hands. That night, back in his darkroom, he worked under the red lamplight, pouring the developer across the glass plate. The liquid rippled and hissed, and the image slowly emerged. 19 faces, clear and sharp, each rendered with the fine detail he prided himself on. The chalkboard behind them bore the date neatly written in white, April 3rd, 1881. But at the edge of the frame, the empty desk drew his eyes and held them. At first, it appeared ordinary, a blur of grain and shadow. Then, as the image brightened, he saw it, the outline of a small hand, faint but undeniable, resting upon the desk's surface. The fingers were slightly curled as if caught mid-motion. Larch froze, leaning closer, the smell of chemicals thick around him. He wiped the glass with a cloth, thinking it residue. The mark remained. He whispered to himself. There were 19. The whisper became a tremor. There were 19. He checked his exposure notes. No error, no movement, no accidental overlap. He even returned to the tray, rewashed the plate, and stared again. The hand remained, paler than bone, clearer than reflection. Hours later, the lamplight guttered out. In the silence, Larch thought he heard a faint breath behind him. He turned sharply, the darkness pressing close, his own reflection quivering in the half-dry glass. But there was nothing, only the echo of that still room and the invisible child seated at a desk no one had used. The next morning, Larch carried the finished print to the headmaster. His steps along the cobbled lane felt heavier than usual, and when he entered the schoolhouse the same air of unease hung about him. Mr. Quill examined the photograph, adjusting his spectacles. "Excellent likeness," he began, then paused. "But why is there a hand on the spare desk?" Larch's jaw tightened. "You noticed it too." Quill's brow furrowed. "I see no cause for concern. Perhaps one of the pupils moved. The exposure was long." "No," Larch said quietly. "No one was there." "I watched them all." Quill frowned, placing the photo face down. "Best not to mention this further." The Towns had enough grief after young Hartley's passing. Larch nodded stiffly and left, but his mind refused rest. That night, he dreamt of a boy's outline pressed into the desk's wood grain, his unseen breath leaving frost upon the glass. By week's end, he swore off school commissions entirely. When asked why, he gave the same answer to every curious neighbor: a mark of breath where none had breathed. Decades later, when the glass negative was rediscovered in the Alderwick archives, curators noticed something that made their hands tremble. The desk, now bright as moonlight, seemed to shine against the fading image. Beneath the faint outline of the hand lay a slate bearing one number, etched faintly yet unmistakably: 20. You're about to hear why that number shouldn't have existed. What follows is drawn from the forgotten case file known as the Larch photograph. The fog rolled over Alderwick like breath from the mine itself, thick, acrid, and heavy enough to turn the morning into a dim, gray dusk. The bell above the schoolhouse clanged weakly in the mist, its sound muffled as if the air had grown too tired to carry it. Thomas Quill, the headmaster, stepped out from his office and adjusted his waistcoat, frowning at the emptiness of the yard. Normally, by this hour, the children would already be running through the gate, boots striking cobblestone, laughter bouncing between the iron fences. But today, silence lingered. The smoke from the nearby furnaces hung low and still, pressing down on everything. He glanced at his pocket watch, then at the attendance book clutched under his arm. The first name on the list already had a small ink blot beside it: Ellis Hartley. "Absent," he murmured, writing the word again for certainty. His handwriting was sharp, deliberate, the kind of script that left no room for doubt. But something in his chest resisted the finality of that single word. A sound came from behind him, boots scuffing the wood. He turned to see young Peter Lorne, one of his pupils, standing in the doorway, cap in hand. "Sir," the boy whispered, eyes lowered, "Ellis won't be coming." Thomas Quill sighed, setting his pen aside. "I'm aware. His mother sent word last week." The boy hesitated. "But I saw him, sir." "Yesterday." By the quarry path, the headmaster froze. The faint creak of the building's rafters filled the silence between them. "You must be mistaken," he said carefully. "Dr. Winrow certified his passing. Ellis died of lung fever." Peter shook his head, his small fingers tightening around his cap. "He waved to me," he said softly. "Said he was late." A chill climbed the back of Quill's neck. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with forced calm, the headmaster dismissed the boy and turned back toward the logbook. His quill hovered above the line marked April 3rd, and though he meant to close it, the ink trailed slightly, bleeding like a dark wound across the page. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the schoolyard whole. That evening, after the last pupil had gone home, Thomas lit a candle in his office and reached for the small brass key that opened the parish chest. The records inside were sacred: births, baptisms, deaths. He found Ellis Hartley's entry quickly enough. March 27th. Death by lung fever. Dr. Winrow's signature followed neatly beneath. Yet the corner of the parchment bore a faint mark that hadn't been there before, a thin gray smudge that looked almost like a fingerprint. He took the document to the window, letting the weak daylight touch it. The mark caught the light strangely, almost shimmering, as though it were wet. Thomas blinked and looked closer. Beneath the doctor's handwriting, nearly invisible, was a single penciled word written at a slant: returned. His breath caught. He closed the book at once and locked the chest again, the key trembling in his hand. At dusk, he visited Dr. Winrow himself. The physician's home sat at the edge of the pit road, its shutters drawn against the constant soot. Inside, the air smelled faintly of camphor and burnt sugar from his tonic mixtures. The doctor was an aging man with deep lines around his eyes, his once black hair now gray and thin. "Returned?" Quill asked without preamble, holding up the ledger page. Winrow adjusted his spectacles and leaned closer to the firelight. "That's not my writing," he said after a moment. "Perhaps an archivist's note. Or a mistake. But you signed this," Quill pressed, pointing to the line. "You saw the boy. You confirmed his death." Winrow nodded slowly, his expression tightening. "I did. I laid him out myself. His mother fainted twice before the coffin was sealed. There can be no confusion." He hesitated then, lowering his voice. "But I will admit something, Thomas. The night after I sent the body to the undertaker, I heard a knock at my back door. When I opened it, there was no one, just the sound of breathing. The fire crackled. Both men stared at each other, their faces lit by flickering orange light. "You think it was him?" Quill whispered. "I think," Winrow replied carefully, "some things in this town do not rest where we put them." A distant clang of metal echoed outside, the sound of a hammer striking iron from the furnaces below. The doctor's eyes darted toward the shuttered window, and for a brief moment the candle flame between them bent sharply, as if drawn toward something unseen. By the time Quill left the house, night had fallen. He walked the narrow path back toward the school, the cobblestones slick with soot and drizzle. Along the fence, small white flowers grew between cracks, hardy things that seemed to glow faintly in the gaslight. When he reached the school gate, he stopped. The door was ajar. Inside, the air smelled faintly of chalk and damp slate. He moved through the empty corridor, his boots echoing against the wooden floorboards. The classroom door stood half open, swaying slightly. Quill stepped forward and froze. On the blackboard, written in pale dust, were 3 words: "I'm still here." The chalk rested neatly on the sill below. Its tip snapped clean in half. He closed the door slowly, heart hammering. Outside, the bell rope swayed, though no wind stirred. Its clapper struck once, a hollow metallic note that lingered far too long. The next morning, when the children arrived, Quill greeted them as usual, his demeanor calm though his eyes betrayed sleeplessness. He marked the attendance carefully, pausing again at the same name, Ellis Hartley. This time his hand shook slightly before he wrote, "Absent." From the far corner of the room, one of the younger boys raised his hand timidly. "Sir?" "Yes, Nathan? Should I move the spare desk back?" "It's in the way again." The headmaster turned. The extra desk, one too many for 19 pupils, stood against the rear wall, faint chalk smudges marking its surface like fingerprints. He swallowed hard. "Leave it," he said quietly. That day he taught with the door open, the sunlight thin but steady. Yet every so often, between lessons, his eyes drifted toward the back of the room. For a moment he thought he saw something, a shadow perhaps, or the faint impression of a boy's shoulder leaning forward. But when he blinked, there was only light. Years later, when researchers uncovered the old ledgers and asked about the strange mark beside April 3rd, none could find Quill's personal notes. The parish chest had gone missing some time after his death. Only the photograph remained to tell the story. And in Alderwick, long after the school itself was gone, villagers would pause on windless mornings to listen. Somewhere in the fog, faint and distant, the bell still rang. They said the school's bell sometimes rang on windless mornings. The first anomaly came quietly, beneath the soft hiss of a gas lamp and the faint tick of the printing press. Samuel Hexton leaned forward, his spectacles glinting in the amber light, as the image of Alderwick School slowly emerged in the developing tray. The smell of chemicals, ether, and varnish hung thick in the cramped workshop, mingling with the damp air that leaked through the old brick walls. It was past midnight, and he was reprinting a photograph requested for the town's upcoming jubilee, a harmless commission, or so he thought. The plate of the school children had been provided by the parish archivist, an old glass negative by Edwin Larch. Yet, as the image darkened into clarity, something about it felt wrong. The desk at the back, the empty one, seemed alive beneath the surface. Its grain shifted faintly, as though wet wood were breathing. He rubbed his eyes, certain it was exhaustion. "Too much mercury," he muttered under his breath, setting the plate aside. But when he turned back, the light from the lamp trembled, casting the photograph in a living shimmer. The desk appeared to swell outward, then contract again, a subtle rhythm, steady and deliberate. Once every few seconds, the breath of something unseen. Samuel stepped closer, his heart thudding. "No," he whispered, "it's just the heat." Yet the room was cold enough for his breath to show. He reached for the shutter to dim the light, but the flickering continued, pulsing in the same silent pattern. He felt the back of his neck prickle. Somewhere beyond the walls, thunder rumbled, a low growl rolling over the valley. He opened his workshop diary and wrote quickly, his hand trembling. "Plate, pulsing faintly at dusk, cannot explain. Appears to respond to light." He signed it, set down his pen, and pressed his palm against the table for steadiness. When the wind struck the shutters again, the lamp guttered, plunging the room into shadow. Moments later, a faint scraping noise broke the silence, chalk on slate. He froze. The school was 2 streets away. No one should have been there at this hour. By dawn, word had reached him that the caretaker, Mr. Bromley, had reported strange sounds from the empty building. "Thought it was the rats at first," Bromley said when Samuel arrived, his lantern swaying as they walked through the corridor lined with peeling paint and dusty benches. "But it weren't the sort of sound rats make." It was writing. They entered the classroom, the same one from the photograph. The air smelled of damp soot and lime. On the blackboard, beneath a thin layer of chalk dust, were faint words scrawled in uneven lines. "I'm late." Bromley's face paled. "I wiped that clean before I left last night." Samuel stared at it, his pulse quickening. "You're sure no one came in?" "The doors were locked," Bromley said. "I've got the only key." Outside, thunder cracked overhead, shaking the windows. The room flickered with lightning, illuminating the rows of desks, 19 of them, clean and empty. The 20th, at the back, bore a faint gleam across its surface, as though someone had just risen from it. Samuel took a step forward, his boots creaking on the floorboards. The sound that followed, a faint exhale, made him stop cold. That night, he returned to his workshop determined to prove it was all coincidence. He locked the doors, covered the windows, and set up the plate under his lamplight again. The clock read 6:43 when the thunder rolled across Alderwick. The pulse began once more, slow, patient, alive. He recorded it in his diary. The plate breathes. Cannot sleep. Days turned to weeks. He stopped attending the Jubilee meetings, ignored his printing orders, and kept the photograph sealed in a wooden case. His wife found him one morning staring at it in silence, muttering about the 20th desk. She tried to take the plate away, but he gripped it tightly, whispering, "He's still there." Neighbors said they heard him pacing through the night, the lamplight in his window burning until dawn. Some claimed that on stormy evenings a flicker of light appeared in the old schoolhouse too, brief, ghost-like, as if the past itself were being replayed through glass and thunder. And though no one ever saw Samuel Hexton again after the winter of that year, his diary remained, its last entry smudged but legible. "It keeps breathing." Nothing else in Alderwick was ever printed from that plate again. Dr. Lionel Brady leaned over the examination table, his breath fogging slightly against the cool air circulating through the museum's underground laboratory. The photograph, sealed under glass and marked Alderwick, 1881, rested before him, its faint silver sheen catching the thin beam of lamplight above. The hum of the new polarizing spectrometer filled the silence, an invention he'd borrowed from Rotherham College for what he thought would be a routine analysis. But as the readings began to flicker on the dial, his brow furrowed. The luminescence was wrong. It pulsed faintly, as if the plate itself exhaled light. He adjusted the lens and whispered, "That's not possible." His assistant, a young technician named Rowan, glanced over from the corner, his hands stilling mid-note. "Sir." Brede motioned him closer. "Look, values peaking at 0.9 candela. That's impossible for nitrate glass this old. It should have gone dull decades ago." Rowan leaned in, squinting at the faint shimmer along the photograph's surface. It seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though the image beneath were not fixed, but breathing. The curator's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the lamp. The desk in the photograph gleamed unnaturally bright under the polarized light. Every other part of the image, the faces, the walls, even the chalkboard, remained motionless, trapped in their century-old stillness. But that desk seemed awake. Brede turned off the lamp abruptly. "Let's not overexpose it. Something about that surface reacts." He tried to steady his thoughts, reminding himself that he was a man of science, not superstition. The following morning, he wrote to Professor Elston at the Royal Institute, enclosing the preliminary readings. Within a week, Elston himself arrived, tall, impatient, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight like small glass coins. He examined the plate in silence for several minutes before saying, "Heat damage, perhaps. A fluctuation in storage temperature." Brede shook his head. "The plate's been kept below 10 degrees since it entered the collection. No exposure, no radiation, no sunlight." Elston frowned, tapping the glass lightly. "Then it's an illusion. Chemical fatigue." But Brede had already tested that theory. He retrieved the earlier plates from the same batch, all dull, lifeless, predictable. "This one doesn't behave like the rest," he said. "Its reflection alters with color. Under red light, the desk brightens. Under blue, it fades." He hesitated before adding, "Under red, I thought I saw movement." Elston scoffed quietly, though a trace of unease crossed his face. "Movement on a photograph, Lionel?" "I know what I saw," Brede replied, his voice lower now. "The grain on the desk, it bent toward the lens." 2 days later, Brede summoned chemist Harold Maersk, known for his meticulous forensic work. Maersk arrived with a black leather case of tools and a manner that was calm to the point of arrogance. "You've got yourself a ghost story, have you?" he muttered, setting up his apparatus. He scraped a near-invisible layer from the corner of the plate and placed it under a small crucible flame. Minutes later, a faint green smoke rose, carrying a sharp, metallic tang. "Arsenic," Maersk said simply, watching the vapor curl. "Traces of it." Brede stiffened. "Impossible. Larch never used arsenic in his solutions," Maersk shrugged. "Then someone else did." He packed his instruments, leaving the faint odor behind like the ghost of a funeral parlor. That night, Brede couldn't sleep. The scent lingered in his clothes, and when he closed his eyes, he thought he saw the outline of a child's desk illuminated from within, a glow breathing behind the glass. The next morning, he sent a telegraph to his assistant. The words were few but urgent. "Do not view under red light again." Then he sealed the plate inside a wooden case, its edges lined with lead, and requested that it be catalogued under restricted artifacts. Weeks passed before he dared look again. When he did, faint indentations, 5 of them, marked the varnish near the upper edge, perfectly spaced, as though fingers had pressed from the inside. He stood in the silent archive, the single bulb above him swaying slightly in the draft. The photograph caught the weak light and reflected it back in a tremor, neither dead nor alive. Brede stepped away slowly, his reflection warping across the glass, as if someone else moved in rhythm with him just beneath the surface. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow of a boy's hand slide across the desk in the image. His breath caught, then it was gone. He exhaled and whispered, "Each expert left more questions than answers, and none agreed on what, or who, caused the exposure." The first theory emerged in a room heavy with dust and debate. It was 1912, inside the gray stone halls of the Alderwick Historical Society, where three men sat around a warped oak table. The photograph lay before them, illuminated by a single oil lamp whose flame flickered each time the wind found a crack in the wall. Professor Grantley, a retired physicist, leaned close, tapping the glass with a cautious fingertip. "Double exposure," he murmured, his voice brittle from age. "Larch must have reused a plate, a simple mechanical error." His tone carried the certainty of a man unwilling to admit mystery into his world. Yet even as he spoke, his reflection wavered faintly across the surface of the photo, overlapping, imperfect, almost as if his face too were captured twice. Across from him, Reverend Alton shook his head. The cleric's eyes were pale and weary, but they held conviction. "Then where," he asked softly, "is the proof?" Larch's surviving negatives show none of this, no misalignment, no duplication, and every one of his glass plates bears a signature mark etched at the corner. This one does not. The room fell silent. Rain began to patter against the leaded windows, each drop echoing in the hush. For a long time, no one moved. It was as though the photograph itself demanded quiet respect, its faint glow standing out even against the dim lamplight. Decades later, the debate rekindled in a new form. In 1954, curator Edwin Rathbone reopened the case after discovering Larch's handwritten notes stored in a forgotten envelope. His handwriting, neat, slanted, deliberate, documented each photograph by date and subject. The page for April 3rd was clear. 19 pupils. No mention of an extra desk. Yet, beside that date, the headmaster's signature appeared. Thomas Quill's distinct looping mark, authentic and aged precisely to the year 1881. Rathbone frowned, realizing the entry had been made before Ellis Hartley's death had even become public. The ink was older than the announcement itself. "How," he muttered, "could a dead boy sit before the camera a week before he was mourned?" Rathbone's assistant, a quiet young man named Julian Marsh, looked up from the table. "Perhaps it was staged," he suggested hesitantly. "A memorial of some kind." The headmaster may have wished to honor the child. Rathbone dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. "No memorial," he said. "No teacher would mark the date as attendance." This was logged as a living record, not remembrance. The statement hung in the air like the echo of a closing door. The procedural theorists clung to their explanation nonetheless. They argued that grief could drive men to strange acts, that Quill, perhaps overcome with remorse, had reconstructed his class as it should have been, adding Ellis's desk as a tribute. But each claim withered under scrutiny. The attendance log's ink predated the boy's death, and the exposure on the glass negative showed no signs of tampering. The chemicals aligned too perfectly, the lighting too consistent. Every test confirmed the impossible. The image was genuine, and it had captured something, or someone, that was not supposed to exist. As the years passed, the photograph changed hands and institutions, gathering theories like dust. Then came the third camp, the ones who refused to call it accident or tribute. They believed, as one paper published in 1967 declared, that the plate had captured a fracture in chronology, a moment folded over upon itself. Their belief was not spiritual but scientific. Time, they argued, was not linear but elastic, capable of recording echoes of what should have been rather than what was. The photograph, in this view, was not haunted but misaligned, its lens opening onto a second parallel instant where Ellis Hartley had not yet died. That idea took root in the corridors of academia. In 1979, Dr. Malcolm Frey of Rotherham Technical Institute conducted the most exhaustive analysis to date. He placed the glass negative beneath a spectrographic scanner capable of measuring the faintest light emissions. The lab was silent except for the hum of machines. Frey adjusted the dials carefully, his fingers trembling slightly, aware that the plate was older than any instrument in the room. The monitor blinked once, twice, and then, inexplicably, displayed rhythmic pulses in the emulsion. They repeated every 5 seconds, faint but undeniable. Frey leaned forward, his breath fogging the protective shield. "That's not possible," he whispered. He repeated the test twice more, then again with the room temperature altered by 2 degrees. Each time, the same phenomenon. A pulse, as though the glass were responding to the warmth of his breath. Later that evening, Frey wrote in his lab notes, "The reaction persists only when exposed to heat. None when cooled. The emulsion behaves as if inhaling." He stopped there, unable or unwilling to draw conclusions. The university sealed his results within the archive under the label anomalous behavior, organic mimicry. When asked about it years later, Frey refused comment, claiming the readings were instrument error. But his assistant, Harold Dent, told a different story. He heard something, Dent confessed in an interview. While the pulse ran, there was a faint sound on the metal table. Like someone breathing through glass, rumors grew quickly after that. Some said the photograph itself was alive in a way, its chemicals still reacting to a presence unseen. Others whispered that it had become a doorway, that Larch's camera had caught a sliver of a life lost too soon and trapped it forever between exposure and memory. By the 1980s, the image had become more myth than artifact, but its evidence remained unchallenged. Every scientific test had failed to explain why the plate brightened at touch, why warmth awakened its faint pulse, or why the empty desk seemed to glow under the softest light. Through every theory, scientific, emotional, or supernatural, one truth endured. None could erase the question that lingered in every mind that studied the photograph. What if Edwin Larch's lens had not recorded the living at all? What if it had reached through the narrow fault line between what was and what should have been, imprinting a moment that had never belonged to time? The experts still argue, their debates scattered through archives and journals, but the question remains, echoing through every reprint and restored image. What if the camera did not capture who was there, but who should have been? The alarm shattered the quiet at precisely 3:17 a.m. Peter Marnell jolted awake, his breath caught halfway between dream and panic. The shrill sound filled every corner of his London flat, bouncing off shelves of boxed archives and framed prints. For a moment, he thought it was a false signal, an electrical fault perhaps, but then came the faint, unmistakable hiss of fog against glass. He sat up, blinking toward the dim red glow of the temperature monitor on his desk. The frame, that frame, was fogged from the inside. He stumbled from his bed, wrapping his robe tightly as he crossed the floor. The air felt unnaturally heavy, as if something ancient had crept in while he slept. A cold scent hung around him, not metallic or sterile like his usual chemical workspace, but earthy, like coal dust mixed with wood polish and something faintly sweet, like varnish aged in damp air. He stopped just short of the sealed display. The glass was misted over entirely, the outline of the photograph hidden beneath a veil of condensation. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. The seal was vacuum tight. He had tested it twice. His fingers hovered over the latch before he hesitated. A rational voice in his head whispered about humidity sensors and air conditioning faults, yet the deeper instinct, the one that had drawn him to obscure relics and forgotten negatives, told him this was something else. He released the catch slowly. A faint hiss escaped, followed by a gust of cold, stale air that seemed to breathe outward rather than release. Peter leaned close, heart pounding as the fog began to thin. The familiar image emerged: 19 students, the teacher, the chalkboard, and that haunting empty desk at the back. But something was different. A darker tone bled along the right edge of the desk, as though a shadow had deepened there overnight. He reached for his cleaning cloth, gently brushing the surface of the glass. The residue felt warm, though the frame had been kept at a constant 10 degrees Celsius. When the glass cleared completely, Peter froze. There was a hand, faint, translucent, but undeniably there, resting beside the one already visible on the empty desk. The two shapes overlapped, yet each was distinct in size and position. One was small, childlike. The other longer, older, almost paternal. The sight drew the air from his lungs. He whispered to himself, "There's two now." His reflection trembled in the glass, blurred between the pale faces of the children. For the first time in years, Peter felt a pulse of fear that logic could not soothe. He grabbed his notebook, scribbling observations. Second hand, slight enlargement of light bloom near desk, possible chemical shift, or reflection artifact. But the last word blurred as his pen scratched to a halt. The smell of coal had grown stronger. Somewhere deep in the silence of his flat a single knock echoed, dull and hollow, like wood meeting wood. He turned sharply toward the sound, eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steadier than he felt. Only the hum of the refrigerator answered. Yet when he faced the frame again, he thought he saw movement, a slow shimmer along the edge of the photograph, like air disturbed by heat. He blinked hard, once, twice. The shimmer was gone, but the faint impression of breath now clouded the glass again, from inside. The following morning, Peter arrived at the museum carrying the sealed frame wrapped in cloth. The curator on duty, Mr. Giles, raised a brow as Peter entered the dimly lit conservation room. "You look like you haven't slept," Giles remarked, half concerned, half annoyed. "I didn't," Peter replied quietly, placing the wrapped frame on the counter. "I need you to help me test something." Without the red light, Giles frowned. "That's against protocol." "Then break it." The sharpness in Peter's tone surprised them both. They removed the cloth carefully. Under the fluorescent light, the photograph appeared normal again. No extra hand, no fog, no scent. But when Giles adjusted the polarizing lamp, the image shimmered faintly. For a fraction of a second, both men saw the same thing. A faint outline shifting across the back row, like someone rising from a seat unseen before. The lamp flickered, the smell of ozone filled the air, and the fuse snapped, plunging the room into darkness. Giles cursed under his breath, fumbling for the switchboard. Peter's pulse raced. In that moment of blackness he heard it again, a faint, distant tapping, like the sound of chalk against slate. When the lights returned, the room was empty except for the two of them and the photograph. Yet the chalkboard in the image had changed. The writing, previously an indistinct blur, now showed a word scrawled faintly in gray dust. Peter leaned in close. It read, "I remember." Neither man spoke. Giles stepped back, pale, mumbling something about heat reaction, about light residue from older emulsions. But Peter knew the difference between science and something that only pretended to obey it. He sealed the frame again and logged the event. Weeks later, reports began surfacing from other archivists. Photographs from the same storage vault showed similar distortions, blurred outlines, smudged reflections, faint handprints pressed into the glass. One technician claimed that when she looked into a certain negative under magnification, she could see eyes staring back. By 1986, the museum director ordered the vault sealed, "Due to electrical interference." Peter knew there were no electrical systems inside. He had disconnected them himself after the second incident. Still, the files labeled Alderwick School 1881 were locked away, their shelves marked with yellow tape. Peter retired soon after, but the photograph remained, preserved, digitized, and stored under restricted access. To this day, those who've viewed the high-resolution scan report the same anomaly. The chalkboard fades slowly until every line disappears except one word: present. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.